The floor did not lead to a cellar. It led to a room that was never supposed to exist. When Daniel Mercer lowered his flashlight through the hole in the kitchen floor, the beam found 4 wooden chairs arranged in a perfect circle around a low stone platform. On the platform sat an oil lamp, and beside it was a photograph. Daniel couldn't make out the faces at first. He lowered himself onto the first stone step and raised the flashlight again. 5 people stood inside the underground room. 4 were strangers. The 5th was Walter Bell. Daniel recognized him immediately. Walter had been the 77-year-old owner who sold Daniel and Claire the farmhouse 11 months earlier. There was only one problem. Walter Bell had died 23 years before the photograph was taken. Daniel nearly dropped the picture. Claire. She climbed down beside him. What? Look at this. She took the photograph. Her expression changed. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a date. October 18th, 2025. The exact day they had pulled up the kitchen floor. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The farmhouse stood nearly 8 miles beyond the last gas station outside Ava, Missouri, at the end of a gravel road that disappeared between 2 steep wooded ridges. There was no cell service at the property. The nearest neighbor was across a hollow, and the nearest hospital was more than 30 miles away. Daniel had bought the place because it was cheap. $79,000 for an 1890 farmhouse, 11 acres, and a detached barn. The low price had seemed like a blessing. Now he was beginning to understand it. Claire turned the photograph over again. Daniel, this wasn't here before. He looked at her. What do you mean? The room. She pointed toward the walls. We've been inside this house for 11 months. We repaired the chimney. We crawled under the porch. There isn't supposed to be anything underneath this kitchen. She was right. The original county survey showed no basement. The previous inspection report mentioned only a shallow crawl space. Yet beneath their feet was a stone staircase descending at least 20 feet into the ground. Daniel stepped lower. The air became colder. Then he saw the wall. A massive human-shaped figure had been carved into the limestone. It had arms stretched outward and no face at all. Around it were rows of symbols neither of them recognized. Claire whispered, "What is that?" Before Daniel could answer, the kitchen floor creaked above them. Both looked up. Someone was standing at the opening. It was Vernon Hale, their 78-year-old neighbor. He stared down at the photograph in Claire's hand. The color drained from his face. "You found it," he said. Daniel climbed 1 step toward him. "Found what?" Vernon shook his head. "You need to put that floor back." "Why?" The old man looked past Daniel toward the carved figure. Then he said something so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. "Because Walter wasn't the last man who went down there." He turned toward the kitchen. Daniel called after him. "Mr. Hale, who was?" Vernon stopped at the doorway. He didn't turn around. "You will be. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, what city are you listening from?" Daniel Mercer had never believed in haunted houses. He believed in bad wiring, bad roofs, bad plumbing, and sellers who knew exactly how much trouble a property was hiding. That was why the farmhouse had seemed like a bargain. Daniel was 36 and worked remotely as a claims adjuster. Claire, 34, restored antique furniture from a small workshop attached to their garage. They had spent almost 2 years looking for a place where they could get out of the city, have enough land for a garden, and still afford the mortgage. The Bell farmhouse had checked every box. Mostly. The listing had been online for only 9 days when they drove out to see it. Walter Bell met them at the gate. He was a quiet man with a grey beard, a bad left knee, and a habit of keeping one hand inside his coat pocket while he talked. He showed them the house without enthusiasm. "Roof's good enough," he had said. "Good enough?" Daniel asked. Walter shrugged. "That's how houses last out here." The kitchen floor had bothered Claire immediately. Several boards were darker than the others, and one section near the old cast-iron stove felt slightly soft beneath her boots. Walter noticed her looking. "Don't pull those up," Claire laughed. I wasn't planning to. I mean it. He had said it without anger. That was what made it strange. Daniel remembered the moment because, during the closing, Walter had done something even stranger. He lowered the sale price by $6,000. No negotiation, no explanation, just a handwritten adjustment on the final agreement. Daniel had asked why. Walter looked at him for several seconds. Because you're willing to take the house. At the time, Daniel thought it was an old man's way of saying nobody else wanted the property. 3 months later, they learned that wasn't true. The previous owners had been Bell family members for at least 5 generations. Daniel found their names in county records going back to 1903, but the farmhouse itself appeared on an older handwritten tax ledger from 1889, and beneath the name Bell, someone had written another word. Kepper. Daniel couldn't find it in any dictionary. Claire thought it was probably an old spelling mistake. Walter had disagreed. They had been sitting on the porch when Daniel mentioned the ledger. Walter's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Where'd you see that? At the courthouse. Walter stared toward the tree line. Don't go digging through things that don't belong to you. Daniel smiled. It's public records. Walter didn't smile back. 2 weeks later, Walter sold the property. 11 months after that, he died. The official cause was a heart attack while hunting near Willow Springs. But Daniel had eventually learned something else. Walter hadn't died at the farmhouse. He had been found 3 miles away, beside an abandoned logging road, still carrying the farmhouse key in his coat pocket. That detail had bothered Daniel for months. Why would a man who had sold his house 11 months earlier still carry its key? Now, standing above the hidden staircase, Daniel understood that the question had never really been about the key. It was about what Walter believed he was leaving behind, and why he had chosen Daniel and Claire to inherit it. The next morning, Daniel drove across the hollow to find Vernon Hale. He didn't call first. There was no point. Cell service disappeared halfway down the ridge, and Vernon rarely answered the landline before breakfast anyway. The road to his place was little more than 2 muddy tire tracks squeezed between oak trees. Recent rain had turned the lower section into brown clay. Daniel's pickup slid twice before reaching the farmhouse. Vernon was already outside. He sat on an overturned feed bucket beside a rusted tractor, cleaning dirt from beneath his fingernails with the tip of a pocket knife. You shouldn't have gone down there, he said. Daniel stopped. You knew about the room. Vernon kept scraping. I knew there was a room. Under my kitchen? Under that house. Daniel studied him. What does that mean? Vernon finally looked up. His eyes were pale blue and unexpectedly sharp. Means the house isn't the oldest thing on that hill. That answer irritated Daniel more than it frightened him. He pulled the photograph from his jacket. I found this. Vernon saw Walter's face. His knife stopped moving. Where? Downstairs. You shouldn't have brought it here. Why? Vernon stood slowly. Because things like that have a way of making people curious. Daniel almost laughed. I'm already curious. No. Vernon folded the knife shut. You're frightened. Curiosity comes after. Daniel handed him the photograph. Vernon held it without looking at the other faces. Walter took this? You tell me. I can't. You knew him. I knew his father. I knew his grandfather. Walter and I weren't friends. Then why did he sell me the property? Vernon returned the photograph. Because he was running out of time. Daniel waited. Vernon looked toward the opposite ridge. A hawk circled above the trees. Every year, Walter went down there on one night. What night? Vernon's mouth tightened. That's not something you say out loud. Why? Because the old families didn't. Daniel noticed something hanging from the porch post. A small horseshoe had been nailed upside down, with a strip of faded red cloth tied through one of the holes. What is that? Vernon glanced at it. Nothing. You've got a strange definition of nothing. For the first time, Vernon almost smiled. Then he said, My grandmother used to tell me never to walk across the Bell property after midnight in October. Because of the room? No. He looked directly at Daniel. Because sometimes you could hear people talking under the ground. Daniel felt his expression change. People? Vernon nodded. That's what they sounded like? Who were they? That's the part nobody agrees on. He handed the photograph back. Some said they were praying. Some said they were counting. My grandfather said they were waiting. Daniel looked toward the wooded ridge beyond Vernon's barn. What were they waiting for? Vernon picked up his feed bucket. You're asking the wrong question. He walked toward the barn. Daniel followed. What question should I ask? Vernon stopped at the door. Why did Walter wait 23 years to sell that house? Daniel said nothing. Vernon opened the barn door. Inside, hanging from a nail beside an old saddle, was a framed photograph. Daniel recognized the same stone room, but this photograph was older, much older. And standing in the center was a young Walter Bell. Daniel did not tell Claire about the second photograph until they were back at the farmhouse. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because seeing Walter in that room as a young man had changed the mystery from something old into something personal. Claire was in the kitchen, kneeling beside the exposed floorboards with a tape measure. She looked up. You're quiet. Vernon had another photograph. Of the room? Daniel nodded. Walter was in it. Older? No. Young. Claire stood. How young? Maybe 25. She stared at him. Daniel, Walter would have been around 50 when he sold us the house. I know. The two of them looked at the open section of flooring. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Claire pointed toward the cast-iron stove. Help me move that. What for? I found something. They shifted the stove 6 inches. Beneath it, hidden under layers of grease-blackened dust, was a narrow strip of oak flooring that looked newer than everything around it. Claire slipped a screwdriver underneath. The board lifted easily. There was no basement beneath it. Only a shallow cavity about 18 inches deep. Inside lay a brass key. Beside it was a folded piece of paper sealed in wax. Daniel picked up the key. It was heavy, old-fashioned, and dark with tarnish. The paper carried one line. 7 steps. 3rd stone. Claire looked toward the hole in the floor. The staircase. Daniel nodded. They descended again just after sunset. The temperature dropped noticeably below the kitchen. Claire counted each step aloud. 1, 2, 3. Daniel stopped. The 3rd stone was different. A thin crack ran across its surface. He pressed his fingers against it. Nothing. Claire pointed toward the wall. Look. Beside the faceless carving was a small iron fitting. The brass key fit perfectly. Daniel turned it. Something clicked it inside the stone. A narrow section of wall moved inward by less than an inch. They both froze. Daniel pulled. The stone slab opened into a compartment barely large enough to hold a book. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. Its cover was cracked and stained almost black around the edges. Claire reached for it. Daniel stopped her. Wait. He noticed something scratched into the inside edge of the compartment. The same 4 symbols from the photograph. But beneath them was a sentence in English. Do not open on the keeping night. Claire looked at the date on her phone. October 18th. What's the keeping night? Daniel didn't answer. He opened the ledger. The first pages were filled with names. Bell, Harrison, Dale, Mercer. He stopped. His own surname appeared on the 4th page. Mercer, 1932. Claire leaned closer. Daniel. He turned the page. There were dozens of names. Most had dates beside them. Several were crossed out. Some ended abruptly. Then he saw the final entry. It had been written in fresh black ink. Mercer, 2025. Underneath it was a single sentence. The house has a new keeper. Daniel stared at the words. Claire whispered, "You said Walter sold us the house." "I did." "Then why does this book say we were assigned to it?" Before Daniel could answer, something struck the kitchen floor above them. Once, then again, slowly. 3 heavy knocks. Neither of them had left anyone upstairs. The man who came to the farmhouse 3 days later did not look like someone who spent his life studying the dead. Professor Elias Voss arrived in a mud-streaked Subaru at 9:40 on a Thursday morning, carrying 2 canvas bags, a thermos, and a folder so swollen with papers that the metal clasp could barely close. He was 71, retired from a university in Missouri, and had spent more than 40 years documenting forgotten religious communities throughout the Ozarks. Vernon had given Daniel his number. He had also given Daniel one instruction. Don't tell him everything over the phone. Daniel hadn't. Voss entered the kitchen, looked at the exposed floor, and stopped. Not because of the staircase, because of the symbol carved beside it. He stared for nearly 20 seconds. Claire noticed. "You recognize it?" Voss adjusted his glasses. "I've seen similar markings." "Where?" "Old immigrant settlements, mostly 19th century. Daniel opened the leather ledger. "Does this mean anything?" Voss read the first page. Then another. His expression remained controlled, but his thumb began rubbing against the edge of the paper. "These names are family records." "Family records for what?" "Religious observance?" Claire folded her arms. "What kind?" Voss looked toward the staircase. "Private." That answer didn't satisfy either of them. Daniel showed him the photograph. Voss studied Walter's face. Then he turned the picture over. When he saw the date, his expression changed. "You said you found this today?" "No." "October 18th. Voss looked at Daniel. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Because the film stock used for this photograph wasn't manufactured in the United States until the 1930s. Daniel stared at him. Walter appeared in a photograph dated 2025. That wasn't the impossible part anymore. The impossible part was that the picture itself looked old. The corners were faded, the paper had yellowed, even the faces had the soft blur of photographs printed decades earlier. "Professor," Claire said, "what is this room?" Voss hesitated. Then he gave them an answer. It was probably a private chapel used by an isolated religious group. Daniel remembered the symbols. The same group that lived under several houses? Voss looked at him sharply. Daniel hadn't told him about the other properties. "You know about them," Daniel said. "I know rumors." "That's not what I asked." Voss closed the ledger. "You shouldn't pursue this." "Why?" "Because some historical questions are better left unanswered." Claire stepped closer. "You came all the way out here to tell us that?" Voss gathered his papers. "I came because Vernon called me." He reached the door. Daniel followed. "You're lying." Voss stopped. For several seconds he stood with his hand on the doorknob. Then he quietly said, "Yes." He turned around. "I've been studying these rooms since 1987. Daniel felt the room tighten around them. "How many have you found?" Voss looked toward the staircase. 7. "And what's inside them?" Voss's eyes settled on the carved figure. "I don't know." Then he added, "But this is the first one I've seen that was sold outside the bloodline." Elias Voss returned the following morning with 7 manila folders. He placed them across Daniel's kitchen table without saying a word. Each folder carried a county name: Douglas, Ozark, Howell, Stone, Shannon, then 3 others from Arkansas. Claire stared at the pile. "You said 7. "I found 7 chambers," Voss replied. "There may be more." Daniel opened the first folder. Inside was a photograph of a farmhouse that looked ordinary enough to be forgotten. Built in 1911, sold in 1964, abandoned in 1978. Underneath was a newspaper clipping. Local farmer killed in barn accident. Daniel read the next page. The farmer's wife had disappeared 3 months later. Their two sons sold the property and left Missouri. No one knew where they went. The second folder contained a similar story. A family in northern Arkansas abandoned their home in 1959 after the father reportedly became convinced that someone was living beneath the house. The official explanation was tuberculosis and mental deterioration. Voss slid another photograph across the table. It showed a stone chamber beneath a farmhouse. Same chairs, same carved figure, same 4 symbols. Daniel looked up. These are the same. Yes. How many families knew about this? That's difficult to say. Try. Voss sighed. 16 families that I can document. Claire opened another folder. Several names had been marked in red. Bell. Harrison, Pruitt, Dale, Mercer. She looked at Daniel. Mercer? Voss nodded. Your family name appears in records connected to one of the Arkansas sites. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. My family? Different branch, I believe. You believe? I haven't finished tracing it. Voss pulled out an old county map. Red dots had been drawn across Missouri and Arkansas. Then he placed 3 more maps beside it. Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee. The same family names appeared again and again, not always spelled the same, but close enough. Daniel stared at the markings. What were these people doing? Voss answered carefully. Maintaining something. Like what? I don't know. That isn't good enough. No, Voss said. It isn't. He opened a final folder. Inside was a copy of a 1941 sheriff's report. A Bell family member had reported hearing voices beneath his kitchen. The sheriff investigated. He found nothing. 3 days later, the Bell man withdrew the complaint. Beside his signature was a handwritten note from the sheriff. Subject requested that no further investigation be made. Stated family matter. Daniel read it twice. Why would someone report voices and then refuse help? Voss looked toward the exposed staircase. Because the family had been doing this for generations. Doing what? Going downstairs? The answer sat between them. Claire pointed to the map. What happens when they stop? Voss didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a photograph from the bottom folder. It showed a farmhouse in Kentucky. The date was 1972. The family had sold it to outsiders. 6 months later, the new owners discovered a hidden staircase. 14 months after that, the husband disappeared. His wife left without selling the property. Their children were placed with relatives. Daniel looked at Voss. You said this house is different because it was sold outside the bloodline. Voss nodded. That's what concerns me. Why? Because the old families weren't protecting themselves from the chamber. He tapped the photograph. They were protecting the chamber from something else. For the first time, Daniel understood why Voss had been afraid. The underground rooms were not scattered religious sites. They were pieces of the same system. And someone, Meware, had been maintaining it for generations. Walter Bell had not sold the farmhouse because he wanted the money. Daniel learned that from a document hidden inside the county recorder's office in Ava. Voss found it on a Friday afternoon, buried among property transfers from 1902. The document was handwritten, unsigned by any attorney, and never entered into the official deed records. At the top were 12 names. All belonged to Bell family members. At the bottom was a sentence written in darker ink. The house shall remain with the blood that keeps the room. Daniel read it twice. What does that mean? Voss didn't answer. He was looking at the date, 1902. But beneath it, someone had added another note almost 70 years later. Agreement renewed 1978. Then another. Renewed 1990. And finally, renewed 2002. Daniel's mouth went dry. Walter was supposed to renew it. Yes, but he didn't. Voss shook his head. He couldn't. Why? Because Walter was the last Bell. Claire looked at the document. So there was nobody left to inherit it. Voss nodded. Not legally, not in the way the family understood inheritance. Daniel thought about the ledger. The house has a new keeper. Then why sell it to us? Voss looked at him. That is the question. They drove back to the farmhouse before sunset. The road was slick from rain, and low fog had settled between the ridges. By the time they reached the property, the house was already disappearing behind the trees. Claire noticed the envelope first. It had been pushed beneath the front door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Daniel recognized the handwriting immediately. Walter's. I could not keep it. That was all. Claire turned the page over. Nothing. Then Daniel noticed a second line written so faintly it was almost invisible. He held it near the window. So I gave it to someone who could. Claire looked at him. Us? Daniel didn't answer. Voss took the paper. His face hardened. No. What? You were not chosen because you could keep it. He pointed toward the sentence. You were chosen because you were outsiders. Daniel stared at him. Voss explained what the old families had apparently believed for generations. The chamber belonged to the property. The property belonged to the family. And the family carried the obligation. But if the property passed to someone outside the bloodline, the obligation did not disappear. It transferred. Claire's voice dropped. So Walter knew this would happen? Yes. He knew we'd find the room. Yes. He knew what would happen to us. Voss looked away. I think he knew enough. Daniel felt anger rising. He sold us a house knowing it came with this. Voss corrected him quietly. He didn't sell you the house. Daniel stared at him. Voss looked toward the kitchen. He sold you the responsibility. A sound came from beneath the floor. Not a knock this time. A slow scrape, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Everyone went silent. The sound stopped. Then came 3 faint knocks, from underneath them. Voss whispered, Don't answer. Daniel looked at the floorboards. Why? Voss's face had gone pale. Because the old records say the first response was never supposed to come from upstairs. Voss refused to go downstairs that night. He stood in the kitchen with his coat still on, staring at the floorboards while Daniel listened to the silence beneath them. Claire finally asked, What happens if we leave? Voss looked at her. I don't know. Then what happens if we stay? I don't know that either. That answer frightened Daniel more than any warning could have. The next morning, Voss brought an old field notebook. Its pages were brittle and covered with measurements, sketches, and dates. He opened to an entry dated June 14th, 1991. A farmhouse in Arkansas, a chamber beneath a bedroom. Same carved figure, same symbols. But beside the drawing, Voss had written something different. The figure is facing inward. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Voss turned the notebook around. The figure isn't standing inside the chamber. He pointed at the carving. It's marking the boundary. Claire studied the faceless shape. Its arms were stretched toward the sides of the wall, almost as though it were blocking an entrance. Voss continued. The families called it a keeper, not a god. Not exactly. What was it keeping? Voss hesitated. That depends on which family record you read. He opened another page. One account called it the Hollow Man. Another called it the One Beneath. A third never gave it a name. It simply referred to the thing beyond the stones. Daniel felt a pressure building behind his eyes. So there was something outside the chamber? No. Voss looked at him. The chamber was outside. That sentence stayed with Daniel. They went downstairs shortly after noon. This time, Voss came with them. The stone room was larger than they had first realized. The walls extended beyond the reach of their flashlights. There were old benches along one side and a narrow drainage channel running around the perime. Jagged. Claire crouched beside it. There are marks here. Daniel knelt. The limestone was stained almost black. Voss shook his head. "Don't touch it." Daniel pulled his hand back. "Why?" "Because I don't know what it is." They followed the wall until they reached the carved figure. Behind it was a seam. Daniel ran his fingers along the stone. "This isn't one wall." Voss looked closer. "No." Together, they found a concealed door. It opened inward. Behind it was another passage. Not a room. A tunnel. Cold air moved through it from somewhere far beyond the farmhouse. Daniel shined his flashlight ahead. The tunnel disappeared into darkness. Voss stopped him. "This is where the old families stopped." "Why?" "Because they were never supposed to go beyond the boundary." Claire noticed something carved into the floor, a circle crossed by 4 lines. The same symbol appeared on the map. Daniel looked at Voss. "What happens if someone crosses it?" Voss didn't answer. Instead, he pointed at a date scratched into the stone. 2002. Below it were 3 initials. W.B. Walter Bell had been here. And beneath his initials was another sentence, fresh enough that the cuts in the stone still held pale dust. The boundary failed once. Daniel stared into the tunnel. For the first time, the mystery stopped feeling like something buried beneath their house. It felt like something the house had been built to hold back. The map was hidden inside the wall behind the carved figure. Voss found it after noticing a narrow crack between 2 limestone blocks. He worked the edge loose with a pocket knife, and a rolled sheet of paper slid into his hand. It was almost 6 feet long. When they spread it across the kitchen table, Daniel initially thought it was an old survey map. Then he saw the red circles. There were dozens. Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma. Each circle marked a property. Some had names beside them. Others had only dates. Voss traced one line with his finger. "These aren't random." Daniel leaned closer. The properties formed a pattern. Not a straight line, not a county boundary, a shape, a huge geometric figure stretching across several states. The farmhouse sat near one corner. Claire stared at it. How could anyone have planned this? Voss looked at the dates. That's the wrong question. What is the right one? How did they maintain it? Daniel looked at him. You're saying these families knew about each other? Some did. How? Letters, marriages, church visits, property transfers. Voss pulled another document from his folder. It was a letter dated 1936. A Bell family member had written to someone in eastern Tennessee. The letter contained only 6 lines. The final line read, "Our point remains quiet. Keep yours quiet until October." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. How many points are there? Voss counted silently. 31 that I can verify. Claire looked at the map. And all of them have houses? Not anymore. Several locations had been crossed out. Some were marked abandoned. Others said lost. Daniel noticed something else. What's this? He pointed to a cluster of black marks in western Kentucky. Voss went silent. Professor? Those were the failures. What happy, Enid? Voss opened a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings. A family vanished from one property in 1948. Another disappeared in 1967. In 1983, a house burned with nobody inside. In 1999, a family left everything behind after reporting voices beneath their kitchen. Each event had been dismissed as an accident, illness, financial trouble, or voluntary disappearance. But the dates matched the map. Daniel looked at the farmhouse marker. What does ours say? Voss didn't answer. Daniel turned the map. Under the Bell property was a handwritten notation. Transferred. 2025. Beside it was another phrase. Outside blood. Claire whispered, "That's us." Voss nodded. Then Daniel noticed something else. A red line continued east from their farmhouse. It passed through Tennessee, then Kentucky, then disappeared beneath a black circle. Voss covered it with his hand. "What is that?" "Nothing you need to know." Daniel pulled his hand away. "Tell me." Voss looked exhausted. "That is where the boundary failed in 2002. Daniel remembered the initials carved into the tunnel, W.B. Walter Bell. So, Walter knew. Yes. And he wasn't maintaining the chamber. Voss looked toward the dark staircase. No. He was trying to repair what happened. Voss nodded slowly. But he ran out of time. Daniel stared at the map. Then he noticed a date written in the bottom corner. October 31st, 2025. 10 days away. Claire read it too. What happens on that date? Voss folded the map. The keeping night. And this time, he didn't tell them to leave. He told them they needed to find the people who were still keeping it. The people who still kept the old agreement did not live in one town. Voss found 4 of them. A retired nurse from southern Missouri, a widowed farmer from Arkansas, a former church caretaker from Tennessee, and a 72-year-old woman named Ruth Bell, who was Walter's second cousin and the last person in the Bell family willing to speak openly. They arrived at the farmhouse on October 31st, 2025. None of them brought weapons, none brought candles. Each carried a small leather pouch tied with black cord. Ruth entered the kitchen first. She looked at the exposed floor and closed her eyes. "You shouldn't have opened it," she said. Daniel's patience was gone. "Your family sold it to us." Ruth looked at him. "No, Walter sold it to you. What's the difference?" "The difference is that Walter knew what he was doing." She stepped toward the staircase. "The rest of us didn't know whether he'd lost his mind." Claire asked, "What happens tonight?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a folded sheet from her coat. It contained 4 names. She placed it on the kitchen table. "Only 4 people go downstairs." Daniel looked at the list. Ruth Voss, a man named Calvin Price, and Daniel. Claire immediately shook her head. "No." Ruth looked at her. "Your husband is the keeper now. He never agreed to that. Neither did Walter." The words landed harder than Claire expected. At 11:40 p.m., Daniel descended the stairs. The chamber had been cleaned. The old benches were empty. The oil lamp burned in the center. Ruth stood beside the carved figure. Voss held the leather ledger. Calvin carried a small brass bell. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Ruth began reading names, one after another, families, places, dates. Some names were followed by a prayer, others were followed by silence. Daniel recognized several from Voss's map. At midnight, Calvin rang the bell once. The sound traveled through the stone. Then they began speaking together. The words were not Latin, not English, not any language Daniel recognized. At first he heard only 4 voices: Ruth, Voss, Calvin, his own. Then something changed. A 5th voice joined them. It came from somewhere behind the carved wall. Daniel stopped speaking. Voss stopped too. Ruth's face went rigid. Calvin lowered the bell. The 5th voice continued. It sounded like a man whispering through a closed door. Then Daniel heard his own name. "Daniel." He looked at Voss. "Did you hear that?" Voss nodded. The voice came again. "Daniel Mercer?" Ruth stepped backward. "Don't answer." The 5th voice spoke once more. This time it sounded like Claire. "Daniel, come upstairs." Daniel turned toward the staircase. Claire was not there. She was supposed to be waiting above. The voice repeated itself. Closer now. "Daniel." Then every oil lamp in the chamber went out. For several seconds there was complete darkness. Something moved behind the wall. Not a knock, not a scrape. A slow, deliberate movement traveling from one side of the stone to the other. When the lamps returned, the room was empty. Ruth was gone. Calvin was gone. Voss was gone. Daniel stood alone beneath the carved figure. Then he saw the wall. A new symbol had appeared beneath the old one. The stone around it was freshly cut, and underneath the symbol were two sets of initials. C.M. E.M. His children's initials. Daniel climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Claire was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at his face. What happened? Daniel couldn't answer. Because from somewhere beneath the floor, 5 voices had started whispering again. By sunrise, the chamber was empty. Ruth Bell was gone. So was Calvin Price. So was Professor Voss. There were no footprints leading away from the room, no open passage, and no sign that anyone had climbed the stairs. Only the 4 chairs remained. Daniel called the sheriff from the nearest landline. The deputy arrived at 9:18 that morning, searched the farmhouse, photographed the staircase, and spent nearly an hour examining the chamber. He found nothing unusual. By noon, he had decided the 3 missing people had simply left during the night. Daniel knew that was impossible. Voss's Subaru was still parked beside the barn. Ruth's purse was on the kitchen table. Calvin's truck was locked. Nobody had driven away. Before leaving, the deputy looked at the carved initials beneath the faceless figure. "Your kids?" Daniel nodded. The deputy stared at them. Then he said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "Those weren't there when I came in." Daniel looked at him. "You saw the wall?" "First thing." The deputy zipped his evidence bag. There was nothing underneath the old carving. Then he left. Daniel and Claire spent the afternoon searching Voss's abandoned Subaru. They found his notebook, his coat, and a stack of photocopied records. But the most important discovery was inside the glove compartment. A small envelope. Daniel opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "If I disappear, open the final section of the ledger. Do not trust the dates until you understand what they measure." The final section had been sealed with wax. Daniel broke it that evening. The pages contained dozens of property names. Most had been crossed out. Some had dates: 48, 1949, 1950, 9951, 1952, 1953. Beside each was a short notation. Discovered. Transferred. Failed. Daniel turned another page, then another. The final active entry stopped him. Bell Farm, sold to outsiders, 2025. Below it was a date. Discovery, October 18th, 2025. And beneath that, Keeping Night, October 31st, 2025. Daniel frowned. That's already passed. Claire looked over his shoulder. So why are we still here? He turned the page. A second date had been written underneath. Transfer complete, November 18th, 2025. Daniel checked the calendar. Today was October 19th. His hands went cold. 30 days. Then he noticed another column. It contained dates exactly 12 months after each recorded discovery. Schüntbein, 1950, 9951, 1952, 1953, 1954. Every one corresponded to a disappearance, death, abandonment, or unexplained incident. Daniel stared at the pattern. They hadn't been counting from the Keeping Night. They had been counting from the moment the new family discovered the chamber. Claire whispered, 1 year. Daniel nodded. Then he turned to the final page. There was one more entry. Not Bell. Not Mercer. Another property. Another state. Beside it, written in black ink, were 4 words. Sold to outsiders, 2026. Daniel looked at the address. It belonged to a farmhouse in eastern Kentucky, and according to the attached county record, its new owners had bought the property 11 months earlier. 3 weeks ago, they had started renovating the kitchen. Daniel read the Kentucky address 3 times. He recognized the county. Voss had marked it on the map. It was one of the properties listed among the active points. For the first time since opening the kitchen floor, Daniel understood that the farmhouse had never been the center of the mystery. It had been one link, a single house in a chain that stretched across mountains, hollows, farms, and forgotten roads. The next morning, Daniel drove to town and made copies of everything: the ledger, the map, Walter's note, the photographs, the property records. He mailed copies to 3 different people in 3 different states. He didn't know whether that would protect anyone. He only knew he couldn't keep the information inside the farmhouse. Claire stayed with him. Neither of them discussed selling the property. There was no point. They had finally understood what Walter had been trying to escape. He hadn't been running from a house. He had been running from an obligation that followed the land. That evening, Daniel returned to the kitchen. The floorboards were still removed. He stood over the opening and looked down at the stone staircase. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then he noticed something on the 7th step. The old photograph, the one showing Walter. Daniel picked it up. The date on the back had changed. He turned it over again. The ink was still there. October 18th, 2025. But a second line had appeared beneath it. Transferred. Daniel carried the photograph upstairs. Claire was waiting at the table. What does that mean? He showed her. Neither of them spoke. Then Claire looked toward the kitchen window. Across the hollow, a light had appeared in Vernon's house. Daniel hadn't seen it lit in 2 days. He walked outside. The night was cold and clear. From somewhere beneath the ridge came a faint sound, a voice. Not an animal. A bell. One slow ring. Daniel stood still. Then another sound answered from much farther away. Another bell, and another. The calls moved through the hills, one after another, until the entire valley seemed to be answering. Claire came onto the porch. Daniel? He turned toward her. She was holding the Kentucky property record. The final page had been folded back. Something was written on the reverse, not in Walter's handwriting, not Voss's, not anyone Daniel recognized. It was only one sentence. The next house has already opened. 3 states away, on a farm outside a small Kentucky town, a young family had been renovating their kitchen. The property had been purchased 11 months earlier. The previous owner had died before the sale. The inspection report showed no basement, no cellar, no underground structure. But 3 weeks before Daniel found the sentence, the new owners had removed 6 rotten floorboards. They had discovered a staircase beneath them, and according to the photograph attached to the county report, there were 7 stone steps. The family had only reached the 3rd. The picture showed a brass key lying beside the 4th. Daniel looked at the photograph again. Then he noticed the date. August 19th, 2026. Today's date. His eyes moved to the bottom of the image. Someone had written a warning across the stone wall. 3 words. Don't complete them. Daniel stared at it until Claire asked what was wrong. He didn't answer. Because beneath those words, barely visible in the photograph, was the beginning of a familiar symbol. 4 lines, 1 circle, and a 5th line that hadn't existed in their chamber. Daniel understood then that the boundary had not simply been maintained, it had been moving. And somewhere in Kentucky, another family was standing over rotten floorboards, oaking down into darkness, believing they were the first people to ever discover what was underneath.